They tell us Africa was discovered. But how do you discover a land that already had universities, kings, laws, and cities? When Europe was still living in mud huts, Africa was not discovered. Africa was broken before slave ships touched African shores. Africa was not silent. It was alive, alive with movement, voices, rhythm, and purpose. Alive with people who woke up every morning knowing who they were, where they belonged, and what their world meant. Africa did not wait for history to arrive. History was already happening there. Cities breathed with trade, not small villages, not scattered huts, but living cities where roads connected neighborhoods, where markets opened with the sunrise and closed only when the stars appeared. Merchants laid out goods on woven mats. Gold, salt, cloth, leather, grain, tools. Each item had a story, a journey, a value understood by both buyer and seller. Markets spoke dozens of languages. Different tongues blended into one rhythm of exchange. People traveled from far regions, crossing deserts and rivers, not as invaders, but as traders. They came with camels, caravans, boats, and trust. Trade was not chaos. It was order built on reputation and honor. Africa knew the world long before the world claimed to know Africa. Books were written, not printed, but carefully handwritten, word by word, line by line. Ink met paper with patience. Knowledge was treated as something sacred, something alive. Scholars spent their lives studying the stars, the human body, numbers, law, and ethics. They argued, debated, questioned, and recorded their thoughts. These books were not decorations. They were used, shared, taught from, and protected. Knowledge did not belong to one man or one family. It belonged to the community. Laws were debated. Rulers did not always rule alone. Councils of elders advised kings. Decisions were discussed openly. Justice was not blind power, it was balance. If a leader failed his people, he could be challenged. Authority carried responsibility. Africa understood governance long before outsiders claimed it did not. Knowledge was passed like inheritance, from elders to children, from teachers to students, from one generation to the next. Stories were memory. Songs were history. Proverbs were philosophy. A child learned not only how to survive, but how to belong. Africa did not separate life into boxes. Education was not a building, it was living. Science was not a word, it was practice. Art was not decoration, it was identity. Healers understood plants, roots, and herbs. They knew which leaf healed wounds, which bark reduced fever, which mixture brought relief. Farmers read the land like a book. They understood seasons, rain, soil, and wind. Builders shaped homes that breathed with the climate, cool in heat, strong in storms. This was intelligence shaped by centuries of experience. Music was language. Drums spoke across distances. Rhythms carried messages, warnings, celebrations, and prayers. Dance was not performance, it was expression. Every movement meant something. Every pattern told a story. Clothing was identity. Colors, designs, and symbols showed where a person came from, what they believed, and who they were. Africa remembered itself through culture. Families were not isolated units. They were part of a larger whole. The community raised children together. If one house struggled, others helped. If one person fell, they were lifted. Elders were respected, not ignored. Women held power in markets, homes, and traditions. Their voices shaped economies and families. Children were taught responsibility early, not fear. Life was not perfect, but it was balanced. Africa was wealthy, but not obsessed with hoarding. Gold existed, but so did values. Riches were measured not only in resources, but in people, knowledge, and stability. When travelers came from outside Africa, they did not come to teach. They came to learn, to trade, to benefit. Africa was not begging for connection. The world was drawn to Africa. This was not a dark continent. Darkness was never here. This was a bright world, bright with thought, bright with structure, bright with confidence. But brightness attracts shadows. Slowly, the relationship changed. Trade turned into exploitation. Curiosity turned into greed. Respect turned into control. Weapons entered the exchange. Fear replaced trust. Human beings became numbers. The same routes that once carried ideas and goods began to carry suffering. People were taken, not because they were weak, but because they were valuable. Farmers, craftsmen, scholars, leaders, parents, children. Entire communities felt the absence. Fields went silent. Schools lost teachers. Homes lost voices. Africa did not just lose bodies. Africa lost momentum. And then came the lie that Africa had no history, no systems, no civilization. That lie was necessary because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting what was destroyed. So the brightness was covered. Stories were erased. Achievements were ignored. Africa was not discovered. Africa was interrupted. Before chains, Africa stood whole. Thinking, building, teaching, living. And even today, beneath the weight of history, that life still echoes. Because a world that was once alive never truly forgets how to breathe. In the 1300s, in the heart of West Africa, there stood a city called Timbuktu. Not a village, not huts made of mud and silence. A living city of thought. Timbuktu was a global center of learning at a time when much of the world was still struggling to read and write. Knowledge did not arrive here from outside. It was created, discussed, and protected within its walls. More than 700,000 handwritten manuscripts existed in this city, each one carefully written by hand, each one holding ideas that shaped minds and societies. These books spoke of medicine, how the human body works, how illness could be treated. They spoke of astronomy, of stars, planets, and the movement of the sky. They explored mathematics, law, ethics, and philosophy. They asked questions about justice, governance, and human responsibility. Learning in Timbuktu was not rare. It was respected. Students traveled long distances to study here. They came from North Africa, from the Middle East, even from Europe. They crossed deserts and borders not for gold, but for knowledge. At a time when many Europeans could not read, African scholars in Timbuktu were writing books, teaching students, and debating ideas. Teachers sat in courtyards and mosques, surrounded by students. Lessons were spoken, questioned, challenged, and refined. Education was not about memorizing. It was about understanding. Books were passed from family to family like treasure. Manuscripts were protected, hidden, and preserved because knowledge was seen as power. Timbuktu was proof that Africa was thinking while others claimed it was silent. But later, that truth became dangerous. Libraries were burned. Manuscripts were stolen. Others were hidden away to survive. And slowly, Timbuktu was erased from history books. Not because it did not exist, but because its existence challenged a powerful lie. A lie that said Africa had no knowledge, no history, no intellect. Yet the pages still exist. The ink still speaks. And every surviving manuscript whispers the same truth. Africa was not waiting to be taught. Africa was already teaching the world. In the year 1324, a man set out on a journey that would shake the world. His name was Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa. He was not just a king. He was the wealthiest human being in recorded history. When Mansa Musa began his pilgrimage to Mecca, it was not a quiet trip. It was a moving display of power, organization, and unimaginable wealth. Thousands of people traveled with him. Officials, soldiers, servants, and scholars. Camels walked beside them, each carrying gold. Not small amounts. So much gold that it changed economies. As Mansa Musa passed through Egypt, he gave gold generously to the poor, to traders, and to leaders. Gold flowed through the streets like water. For years after his visit, the value of gold in Egypt collapsed. Prices were disrupted. Markets were shaken. Let that sink in. Africa was so rich that one man, on a religious journey, accidentally crashed foreign economies. This wealth did not come from luck. It came from structure. The Mali Empire controlled major trade routes across West Africa. Gold, salt, and goods moved under strict systems of taxation and law. Nothing was random. Everything was organized. Mansa Musa did not rule alone. He governed with advisors, judges, and scholars. Education was supported. Cities were developed. Mosques, libraries, and centers of learning were built. When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca, he did not come back empty-handed. He brought architects, teachers, and scholars with him. He invested in knowledge, not just monuments. Under his rule, cities like Timbuktu flourished even more as centers of education and culture. News of Mansa Musa spread across the world. European maps began to show Africa differently. Some even drew him holding a golden coin, seated on a throne, as a symbol of unmatched wealth. And yet, centuries later, we are told a different story. We are told Africa was always poor, always dependent, always behind. That story is not history. It is convenience. Africa was not poor. Africa was powerful. What changed was not Africa's ability, but Africa's fate. Trade turned into exploitation. Wealth was drained instead of exchanged. Resources were taken, not shared. People were removed, not respected. Africa did not lose its riches by accident. It was made poor through centuries of extraction and violence. Mansa Musa's journey remains as evidence. Proof that Africa once stood at the center of global wealth. Proof that prosperity existed long before chains. And every time history forgets him, it is not because his story is small. It is because his story is dangerous to the lie that followed. Before slavery, Africa was deeply connected to the world. Not hidden, not cut off, not waiting to be found. Africa stood at the center of global movement, where land routes and sea routes met, and where people, goods, and ideas flowed freely. Caravans crossed the Sahara Desert for centuries, not by accident, but by knowledge passed down through generations. African traders knew the stars, the winds, and the paths of the sand. They moved gold from the south, salt from the desert, and knowledge from city to city. These journeys connected West Africa to North Africa, and beyond that, to the Arab world and the Mediterranean. Africa traded with Asia. Across the Indian Ocean, East African ports welcomed ships from India and China. Gold, ivory, spices, and timber were exchanged for silk, ceramics, and new ideas. Languages mixed. Cultures learned from one another. These are not one-sided exchanges. They were relationships built on mutual benefit. Africa traded with Europe long before colonial rule. European merchants came as visitors, not masters. They negotiated prices. They respected local systems. They followed African rules in African markets. Trade happened through agreement, not force. Africa also traded with the Arab world for centuries. Scholars, merchants, and travelers moved between regions, carrying books, beliefs, science, and stories. Cities grew where trade routes crossed. Markets became meeting points of cultures, not battlefields. Gold flowed outward from Africa, shaping economies far beyond its borders. Salt, equally valuable, preserved food and sustained life. Ivory was carved into art and tools. Textiles carried patterns and identity across continents. Ideas traveled just as freely. Ideas about law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and governance. Africa was not a supplier of raw goods alone. Africa was a producer of knowledge. Languages spread. Religions moved. Architectural styles blended. Music, food, and customs crossed borders. This level of connection required structure. There were systems of trust, measures of weight, accepted currencies, and laws to protect traders. Trade routes were guarded. Cities were organized. Diplomacy existed. Isolation is what happens to forgotten places. Africa was never forgotten. When people say Africa was isolated, they are repeating a story written much later. A story meant to make conquest sound like discovery. The truth is simpler and stronger. Africa did not sit at the edge of the world. It helped hold the world together. When slavery arrived, these connections were twisted. Trade became extraction. Movement became forced. Exchange became theft. But before that rupture, Africa was already global. It was central, and every caravan track, every ocean route, every marketplace stands as proof that Africa was not behind the world. Africa was moving with it. When Europe realized Africa's true value, they did not come with respect. They did not come as students or partners. They came with intention. They came with guns, not to protect, but to threaten. Weapons entered places where trade once ruled. Power shifted from negotiation to fear. A single gun could silence an entire village that once stood strong through unity. They came with lies. Lies wrapped in promises of friendship, trade, and protection. Agreements were signed and broken. Words were used to confuse, divide, and weaken. Trust, once the foundation of connection, began to collapse. They came with religion used as control. Not faith as belief, but faith as a tool. Sacred words were twisted to justify domination. Salvation was offered with one hand, while freedom was taken with the other. Spiritual language became a mask for greed, and later, they came with chains. But chains were not the beginning. The damage had already been done. African kingdoms were turned against each other. Old rivalries were fueled. New conflicts were created. Weapons were traded for human lives. Brothers were pushed to hunt brothers. Neighbors were forced to betray neighbors. Trade routes that once carried gold, salt, textiles, and ideas were transformed into human hunting routes. Paths of exchange became paths of capture. Caravans no longer protected travelers. They delivered people in pain. Cities began to empty. Markets grew quiet. Schools lost teachers. Homes lost parents. Entire regions felt the absence of their strongest and brightest. This was not discovery. It was disruption. Not progress, but destruction. Africa did not fall because it lacked civilization. It was pushed into collapse by a system designed to profit from its suffering. And long after the chains were removed, the damage remained. Civilizations destroyed, not discovered. Millions were taken. Farmers, scholars, builders, leaders. This wasn't just slavery. It was intellectual genocide, cultural erasure, historical theft. Africa didn't lose people only. Africa lost its future. If slavery had never happened, Africa's story would have been very different. Its cities would have grown taller, not with glass and steel, but with knowledge and life. Markets would have thrived, filled with voices negotiating ideas as much as goods. Roads would have connected regions, not just for trade, but for learning, culture, and shared progress. Libraries would have multiplied, each one holding manuscripts of science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Universities would have expanded, drawing students from every corner of the world, coming to learn from African scholars who were already centuries ahead in thought. Its inventions, tools, technologies, agricultural methods, astronomical discoveries would have shaped the world. Ships, navigation techniques, medicines, architecture, and mathematics from Africa could have influenced continents in ways history has never allowed us to imagine. Africa was not lacking creativity or intelligence. It was robbed of the chance to show it. But history was rewritten by the winners. The stories of wealth, learning, and ingenuity were hidden or erased. The accomplishments of cities like Timbuktu, the brilliance of scholars, the wealth of empires like Mali and Songhai, all were minimized, dismissed, or forgotten. And the lie was simple. Africa had no history. That lie has echoed through centuries, repeated in books, classrooms, and textbooks. It made conquest easier. It justified exploitation. It made the world believe that Africa had nothing to lose, nothing to teach, nothing to offer. Yet the truth cannot be fully silenced. Beneath the dust of forgotten manuscripts, beneath the ruins of once thriving cities, Africa's history waits. It whispers to those who listen, telling of a past where knowledge flourished, innovation thrived, and civilizations were strong and proud. If we listen closely, we can hear it even today. Africa did have history, and that history was extraordinary. Africa was not discovered. It did not wait quietly for outsiders to notice it, for maps to mark its rivers, or for explorers to give it a name. Africa was alive, thinking, building, creating, and thriving long before anyone arrived with ships or flags. Its cities were centers of learning. Its people were scholars, traders, healers, and builders. Its wealth was immense, not only gold, but knowledge, culture, and human potential. Africa was not discovered. It was interrupted. That interruption came slowly, but with devastating force. Chains were brought, not merely to bind bodies, but to sever futures. Trade routes became paths of capture. Generations were stolen from their homes. Scholars, parents, leaders, and children, all were torn away. Societies were weakened, cities emptied, and knowledge silenced. Libraries burned. Traditions were suppressed. The natural course of a continent full of promise was violently halted, its brilliance overshadowed by exploitation. And yet, every broken chain of history still whispers the truth. It whispers of what was lost, civilizations that could have grown taller, inventions that could have shaped the world, universities that could have educated millions. It whispers of lives cut short, of communities erased, of potential stolen. But it also whispers of resilience. Africa endured. Its spirit, its culture, its knowledge, and its memory survived, carried in songs, stories, art, and the hearts of its people. Civilizations were destroyed so others could rise. But the rise built on theft and violence does not erase the legacy of those who were interrupted. It cannot silence the truth. Africa was never empty, never silent, never behind. Its history is not a void, it is a testament. And if we listen closely, we can still hear it, echoing across time, demanding to be remembered, honored, and understood. Africa was not discovered. Africa lived, and Africa still whispers. They didn't bring civilization to Africa, they stole it.